parents. And I'm not going to read too much off the slide, but just to really ground us in the opening question. Um, it's great to know that both Andrea and Charlotte, you're thinking about not only education, but really looking at the school to prison pipeline, because it is almost not about education. Truthfully, it is about the system in which we are locating the struggle for humanity and liberation and justice. But as folks probably know, and if you don't, then I'm going to invite you to consider that the roots of our school system and all of the injustices that many of us care about, are rooted in, it's in the roots, it's in the DNA, and it's not easily extracted out through just a few good deeds and programs. And so that's just kind of the grounding. And I'm saying this wasn't planned, but I knowing now who's on this in this chat with us, I wanted to ground us in that very clear premise. And you don't have to agree with it. It's just trying it on for size to consider that, okay, if I had a good education, what did it come at the expense of? And so I think that's usually a really helpful way to enter into what we're about to share. So Clara, you could go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit first, and then I'm going to pass it off to Ruth. And I already started a little bit with the setting the historical and political movement context. I'm not going to go into a factual lecture about any of this. I am definitely going to just, similar to what I just spoke of, just remind us that every injustice and inequity we see in education today, you can trace back to how this system was born and started. And as much as we are taught in school and in classes and college, even when we arm ourselves with knowledge about to prepare ourselves to fight for equity, it is still not, we still don't get all of the information. And a lot of the information is based in people's stories and real lives, not in the outcome reports and the data. It's really, that's helpful. It points to patterns. But long before we started collecting data that showed disparities between groups, there have been huge sacrifices borne by Black families, Indigenous families, extremely, poor, just complete economically shut out families, certainly immigrant families, undocumented families, non-English speaking families, non-Christianity practicing families, many families were all, to take part in education, had to give up who they were. And so today, when we think about fixing the education system or making it better for certain communities, a lot of times, unfortunately, even in our best efforts and with some of the best entities and programs and initiatives out there, most of the time we are stuck working at the surface, at the outcome end of it, or we're trying to put a Band-Aid on something that's pretty big. And so what I hope you'll get from today is that there is a way to pay homage to these sacrifices that families have made through centuries. There is a way to do this work out of respect, for history. And there's a way to do this work where you're also making history as you're going, and you're being historical because you're not leaving out the story of people as you're trying to fix a system. And so unlike some folks who work in education, CADRE, and certainly my own personal sort of handprint on CADRE has definitely been about centering parents. And the other thing I will say is that most of the time in education, parents is more of like a fad. Like every 5 or 10 years, there's like a sudden interest in engaging parents. And there's initiatives and money thrown at this need to suddenly have our parents be part of helping make decisions. But unfortunately, most of the time, when the cameras aren't there and the money's not there and the press releases aren't there, parents are often blamed for all the problems in the system. And parents themselves just for being poor and living in a very economically, distraught community, that somehow it's their problem that they didn't get up out of there, and they didn't move and they didn't somehow hustle hard enough to get their kids in a different school. So when you are then concentrated in a school where every family is struggling, you have, it's just really, really incredibly convenient to blame the parents. And that is the culture of most of the schools in places like South Central, the most economically, isolated and marginalized places across any city. Like, you literally, it's not even unique to South Central. South Central definitely has this uniqueness, but if you go to any city, you find out where the struggling students are. There's poverty, of course, mixed in. There's incarceration mixed in. There's mental health challenges mixed in. It's all present. It's pretty consistent. And unfortunately, that is the price we pay for, for the economic system that we live under. So all of that is what we put into our work. And then, it was like this humble learning process of how not to make any of that, not to repeat that history, not to make it worse, not to do harm, not to do any further harm, and certainly to make this a longer term game. So not organizing parents because it's fashionable, or something, there's a grant. Believe me, CADRE's first 10 years, we operated with very little resources, and we had to fight and claw to be relevant and to sort of do what we wanted to do. So I know I'm skipping over lots of details, but it's because it's a lunchtime talk and we want to get more into some of the work that we've done together, Ruth and I, representing both Public Counsel and CADRE, because that's what you're here to learn. But you have our names, and you can communicate with us later if you want to know more about, or just look up the history. There's a lot of it there. But we certainly, I do want to say that we are grounded in that history. We don't ignore it. We don't, and we definitely understand sort of where we are in the long arc of history. And I humbly, invite most people who want to go into education are trying to fix what they want people to have what they had. Right? That's like a common refrain, especially those of us who get a little bit of education. We start to we want to give back, and we want people to have what we had. But that's also, unfortunately, a very narrow lens, because how you have had what you had is also due to a bunch of, several, numerous circumstances that often can't be replicated automatically, right? And so sometimes knowing the history and the pattern of history is easier to go to the source of the problem than to just sort of want to share what you had with others. It's not that easy, unfortunately. I wish it was. So, all right, moving on. I'm going to go to the next slide. And just to let you know why we have this as our title, it was actually the title of a report that we put out exactly 3 years ago this month. Can't believe it's been 3 years, Ruth. But this was the culmination of a 2-year effort that started in 2015 to document, and this is where the partnership between a grassroots community parent organizing center like CADRE and a movement lawyer like Ruth and the team that she's created at Public Counsel to really work together in a different way. And so we have really reimagined and retooled some of the legal tools that lawyers can contribute on behalf of parents. And then for us as the organizers, we have pushed our model of organizing to ensure that parents are truly participating in setting the terms of the debate. And by that, I mean, studying the history, getting politically educated, requesting and analyzing data, connecting the data to their own lives, thinking about the broader community beyond themselves. So not just about their kids, but the community, South LA parents, the historical legacy the legacy that the place of South LA is, and what it means to live and survive there. All of that becomes data, becomes expertise, becomes wisdom, and all of that was marshaled to produce this report. As CADRE, we also, you can go to the next slide, sorry. As CADRE, we also have been doing this since 2001, and it's very small print, so it wasn't meant for you to read every line, but just to show you a photo from 2006, where we were 5 years in, and we had organized a bunch of parents, and we had started, that was like a turning point where we were really showing the world after 3 or 4 years that it wasn't just about winning books and clean bathrooms and more credentialed teachers and at the time, safer, quote unquote, safer schools, which was really a code for law enforcement, but really about the fact that schools were not fulfilling human rights. And that the more that we documented that, the more that parents had the tools to document and turn their painful stories into facts, things that could be received as truth, that was going to be the way that we shifted the narrative about what's happening inside the schools, but also shifting the narrative about the role of parents in improving schools. And so we've been at this for a minute, needless to say, and this is just some historical, artifacts here. And I want to say that we started off door knocking. So we have knocked, in our first 5 years, we knocked on hundreds of doors across multiple sections of South LA. So we don't organize by school, we organize across South LA, but at the same time, we focus in certain geographic areas. And therefore, we do focus on clusters of schools, but we're not attached to any one school site, if you will. And as you'll learn later, with the push out crisis of school to prison pipeline, parents are often managing multiple school campuses and often with multiple kids. And so it doesn't make sense if you're centered on parents to just focus on the transactional empowerment that might happen at one school site, when in fact, it's the bigger picture that parents are actually living through. So next slide. We focus on building relations with parents. And this slide that you see in front of you is part of the report. It's a way we try to do it's supposed to be an iceberg diagram, essentially. Some of you may have seen those. So if you imagine the line going across is like the ocean and, the top is what you see, but the bottom is what's really going on at the same time. And we just want to introduce the idea that there is incredible white supremacy in school discipline. And if you ever wondered why are all the Black kids getting suspended all the time, and if you'd accepted that as sort of fact, hopefully your mind is piqued today to know that there are reasons for that. And it isn't just because all Black kids act out at school. And so, Claire, you could go to the next slide. We've tried to slice this slide, this graphic into two, so we could zoom in on the first one. That's the top. Yes, thank you. And this is the things we hear about. These are the headlines. We hear about kids getting arrested. We hear about, oh my God, we need school police and law enforcement because the kids are out of control. But the part of it is that the response has all been generated from white supremacy. So let's beat them. Let's take metal detectors and wand them, or make them walk through metal detectors. Let's randomly search them like they're all suspects. Let's, arrest, cite, and detain them like criminals on the street. Because, if we do that early when they're 12, maybe they won't do it again when they're 14. But, all of that becomes essentially part of the culture of a lot of schools. And some of you, may already know this, so I'm not trying to speak on it as if folks don't experience this or haven't experienced this, but I just want to really hone in on it. And all of this is really, sort of feeds the narrative that most of these Black and brown schools with Black and brown students predominantly, and more so Black students, and in places like South Area where there are both, and other places around the country, Black and brown, that somehow this justifies the crackdown on schools. If you go to the next slide, but we're saying that, guess what? But all along the way, from transitional kindergarten and preschool all the way through 12th grade, there are things happening that are being put in place that are about social control, and they really reflect, again, white supremacy. So the first thing in the middle is this notion of blaming students and parents for everything. If you're not doing well in school, it must be you. That's a very typical white supremacist tactic, and racist tactic. Like, what do you mean all the Black kids are getting suspended? Well, that's because they all act up. That's what the normal rationale is. That, oh, I don't see color. I see all kids are all kids. Kids are just kids, and sort of denying that there's any bias. Oh, this kid is doing well because they've got a good parent. This kid is not doing well because what their parent is. Yeah, I met their parent, and apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And while we all sort of accepted those things as we were growing up, as you become an adult and you start to make decisions about what you think education should be about. If you become a parent and you use your power as a parent to advocate at a school site, all of these ideas become things that show up in policy and in the culture and climate of a school. And then many times people think that we're making things better by rooting out all the quote unquote bad kids, rooting out all the kids that are, whose parents are on drugs, rooting out the kids whose parents have been arrested, because if we just get them out of our face, our kids won't be around them, and then we'll limit exposure and we'll limit, how much this continues. And again, hopefully in this moment of 2020 where we're reckoning with so much, that people are now more clear that there are roots to everything, and it is not just what you see on the surface, and it certainly isn't automatically buying into what what law enforcement or what sort of the authorities say is wrong with people. The other thing I want to point out, a few things on here, is really not paying attention to history. So like if you grew up in a family that was poor for 3 generations, and your way of surviving is your way of surviving, and it shows up in how you respond to being hungry in your class, or being stressed out in your class, and it shows up as you, I don't know, talking back to the teacher, because the teacher's just stressing you more, and then the teacher just is literally looking at your behavior in that moment and nothing else, and doesn't care about anything else. And that is unfortunately the soul crushing part of many of our schools. So I could go on and on about everything that's on this triangle, but I definitely want to give you taste and flavor. I know I realize we don't have a slide with our websites, but we both on our respective organizations have this report online, so you can actually look into it with more detail. So we'll go to the next one. And those of you who expressed interest in the school to prison pipeline, we're not in any way, this is a very simplified way of showing it, but we wanted to really illustrate the school part of the school to prison pipeline. A lot of people focus on sort of like suspension, and then like, contact with law enforcement, and then juvenile or adult incarceration. But we're also trying to show that it starts off in like how classrooms are managed and how teachers handle any kind of behavior, but in particular behavior they just don't like. And it's happening now, even online. Folks have known that everyone's doing school online now, and it's the same thing as happening on Zoom. So if one of you right now was saying something I didn't like, and I literally, could suspend you, and be like, this kid needs to leave my Zoom, aka class, and get written up and documented as, et cetera. So that's how easy it is. It's very subjective. And we want to show that things that we accept, like, oh, you acted out, you should be suspended, go to detention. Oh yeah, so-and-so's expelled. I think they got expelled. It's like really things that we say all the time as kids. And oh, so-and-so got sent to the office. And we don't realize that all of those things are contributing to the school to prison pipeline. They are things that we grow up thinking is part of keeping order in a school, and we all accept that as part of us getting an education. But unfortunately, it does increase the disengagement between any student and the school, and it does we have found, and research has documented that it is the beginning of it definitely could be the beginning of a spiral. It isn't always, but it definitely could be. In more cases it is. And so it not only does impact graduation, but it impacts your chances of just being detached from any social system that supports you. And then you see on the side that our parents, that's how CADRE started working on this issue, is when we went door knocking, the one thing that was common is that parents didn't have any power when things happened in school. But the most common time that happened was when their kids were suspended. And so as we were trying to develop what CADRE would be about, this notion that their rights were being violated as advocates and defenders of their children became like our big question, like what's happening here, and why is this happening, and what's being violated, if this is happening. And so that's how we got on our track. We work on the school to prison pipeline, but I also want to be very clear that we are trying to completely redefine the role of parents in stopping this, in advocating for their children, in exposing racial bias. You know, we're creating conditions for parents to empower themselves to be able to do this type of advocacy, both individually and collectively through policy change, and not get backlash for it. You know, this is like a moral compass issue where it's just the right thing to do is to care about kids more than control, you know, and because you can have control by having relationships. You can have control by understanding students' histories and circumstances, not just by removing people. So the next slide is just a little bit of a tease into something that we've done in the last 12 years or so. Back, that first picture you saw where we're, you know, all the parents in t-shirts, that led to us mobilizing a lot of stories and evidence and support to really compel LA Unified School District to pass the first ever comprehensive discipline policy that did not rely on zero tolerance and just reactive punishment and kicking everybody out. They were under the gun. They were suspending a lot of special education students. It was out of control. Like, there were thousands of kids being suspended for no reason, no real reason. And then they wanted to put in something that would give more of a roadmap and that would entail both prevention and intervention, and focus on addressing the root causes of behavior and do it in an age-appropriate way. That is what you see at the top, SWP by S. We didn't spell it out, but it stands for School-Wide Positive Behavior and Intervention Supports. And that is a best practice, if you will. It's really not rocket science. It's pretty much, if you went to a decent school, it's probably what you got, where, you know, you got a second chance. You got to tell your story. You got to talk about what's going on at home and why you might be a little frustrated. But because in so many schools students don't get that, the experts had to create a whole research-based, you know, model. And it was a very surprising victory, but it was the game changer for us. In 2007, we rallied people, we got an LA Times article, and we got them to pass this policy. And we've been training parents to monitor ever since whether it's being implemented. And one of the things we did in the shadow report is we gave our view of how it should look, and how parents should be involved in it. And as I mentioned before, we're trying to end the blaming and shaming of parents, and we're trying to have parents be seen as human beings that can be invested in and be included as part of the solution. And so unfortunately, SWP by S doesn't even go far enough in doing that. And so part of our report, and when we said when we documented that LA Unified was not in fact implementing SWP by S with much fidelity, especially in South Central, we are offering up alternatives to how they could do it. And one of the things is based on really scaling up and deepening their parent participation. Meaning, if they have these deep relationships with parents, and parents can honestly say what's going on and what the solutions might be, and they're not judged and shamed, and they don't call, you know, child services on them, that they can actually get to the behavior, they can actually get to the right services, they can actually make sure that the services don't make things worse, you know. And so this is sort of our way of putting forth a more humanizing way of working with parents. So at CADRE, you know, there are many ways to end and disrupt the school to prison pipeline. And we have definitely changed policies that have brought in P by S, restorative justice. We've reduced suspensions in LA Unified to almost nothing. But unfortunately, because they still don't like the same kids that they used to suspend, you know, with the same behaviors, they'll find other ways of pushing them out. And that's like a whole nother webinar. But we want to say that our intervention in working together as CADRE and Public Counsel has been to really, really look at the rights that people have and helping them demand that their rights get fulfilled. And the reason why we use human rights and not just civil rights is because civil rights, for some of you who are interested in the legal profession, is that there's so many limitations in using civil rights for educational justice. It's like if you don't have a class action lawsuit, you kind of don't have a whole lot, you know? And so it is, the burden of proof is quite high to prove that there is discrimination, because you have to prove intent, which is next to impossible. And especially behind closed doors in a classroom, you know? So we have used human rights from the beginning, because it elevates that, it meets the actual expectation that people have, which is like, I shouldn't be struggling, I should have what I need. And when I don't have what I need, my basic needs, all kinds of things, bad things happen. And we're trying to tie our work to this notion that people deserve what they need, period. It isn't about whether they worked hard enough, or, you know, whether they deserve it. You know, it's just, it's fundamental to our coexistence on this planet. So the next slide is just a continuation, and it's just us showing that there's, in the PBS model, there's different tiers of parent participation. And the main point in all of this is that parents have a say in preventing harm and saying, you know, no, that service is not going to help my child. You think you know my child, but you don't know my child. And guess what? If you try to force me to put my child into that after school program, it's not going to work. And giving the parent the platform to be that honest and be part of crafting the intervention that the school determines, like, hey, we're going to do this, otherwise we're going to kick them out. Well, guess what? You need the parent to be a partner, and the parent has to be able to be honest in that conversation. And if they're not, then it's not going to work. So next slide. And just again, just reminding you of the iceberg here. And then the next slide is really like, so what does this all mean now? You know, I've given you a little bit of insight into what we do at CADRE. We are very, you know, our whole model is extremely participatory. Yes, we're community organizers, but some people think community organizers like hitting the streets and protesting, and it can be, but CADRE's part of it is really building the leadership and political capacity of parents who are normally locked out of making any decisions and advocating for their children. They're the marginalized parents that often get blamed and dismissed before they even walk through the door of a school. And so thankfully we have partnered with Ruth and Public Counsel for over a decade now, and to find lawyers that where it's not about them, but it's about the people and their capacity, and that lawyering is, you know, centered and grounded and being accountable to the community. Like, that's what we needed at CADRE. And when we found lawyers like that along the way, Ruth being one of them, and certainly our longest and most trusted and priceless relationship at this point with a movement lawyer, you know, it's a game changer. And I hope also that as you hear Ruth talk, that those of you who are considering law know that, you know, you really have to put something into it to make it really helpful, especially for something like education. So I'm going to pass it off to Ruth, and I know I talked really fast, but I hope it was laid it all out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maisie, for setting that context. And I'm Ruth Cusick. I'm one of the supervising attorneys on the statewide education team at Public Counsel. And I have been so humbled and so fortunate to have met Maisie and learned about CADRE when I was still in law school. I went to the City University of New York School of Law, whose mission is law in the service of human need. So I think, unlike a lot of attorneys, I was lucky to go to a school that was focused on training attorneys really in service, which so much of the legal profession is not that. I feel so thankful, and Maisie and I, and CADRE parents have talked about this a lot, but I learned how to be a movement lawyer at CADRE. So now it's really fortunate. A lot of law students and movement lawyers are beginning to bring this kind of analysis and lens of deep listening and service to community-led work into law schools, but it's still beginning. And in the kind of call to arms that a lot of movement lawyers are attempting in, the law review articles they write, or the other trainings they're able to give, is like a confrontation of law having been a tool and support of a racial capital structure in the United States. And I think so much of the way education policy has evolved around the myth of education as a great American equalizer, like Maisie saying, even well-intentioned, policy folks may come from the lens that's like, I want to get what I got at my privileged school for others versus really confronting the deep roots of the system. Um, so Maisie shared that, we're just giving you a peek into the last shadow report we did together, but my career started in providing movement learning support to CADRE's monitoring of their victory back in 2007. So we released a shadow report together in 2010. And I think you'll see if you go on the CADRE website, the evolution we've had in our interdisciplinary practice about how, the first shadow report to this one, how this was really focused on serving as a tool for parents who were bringing in other parents to examine these practices. And so it's just been amazing to work closely with the CADRE parents and Maisie in now bringing this interdisciplinary approach, which really has us as attorneys thinking about bringing the legal tools we've been trained into to create accessible organizing tools in service of long-term movements. So Maisie shared about the kind of data analysis that parents are doing at their own schools, asking for information about which students are sent out of class. And it was from all of those parent monitoring efforts that when we together frame Public Records Act requests to the district, it's not, oh, we're your attorneys and we're writing this request. It's in deep dialogue around what we know, what information is put out by LA Unified, and what parents are learning, when they're told, oh, we don't have that information, or we don't have a PBIS team yet, ask again later. And how empowering it has been for parents to then examine, oh, my name's on this sign-in sheet. They said it was this meeting, and being able together to push back. So something that now we've done as we help to support folks who work in statewide policy, who work at other large, legal and policy organizations, is to think about solidarity frameworks to ensure that we can do this work in a harm reduction lens, that we don't have policy projects that actually create more harm in the communities we're stating we want to serve. So you can head to the next slide. Clara and I share that what we did together last year. So our movement learning team at Public Counsel now facilitates with Carl Pinkston of the Black Parallel School Board, and Carl with Maisie and several other organizing groups across the state, convenes the Dignity in Schools campaign California to really bring the movement North Star to all of this work. So with Maisie and Carl, we spent time last summer reflecting on what has been this effort and really deep work and call in. I've always seen what Maisie and others have done with us as attorneys as a call in to a different kind of learning together. So we created this tool to provide to our policy coalition. So this is groups across the state. Some of them do direct legal services representing families in special education and school discipline defense. Others, do work on bills every year. Others, frame large class action lawsuits across the state. And so we thought, what can we provide as a real tool? And you can see here in this visual, and Maisie and Carl, we were all able to kind of use this as a teaching tool, and we continue to use it and refine it and think about how to offer tools to kind of unlearn traditional legal practices, is a self-reflection, from the advocacy lens, and then from a systemic lens, how full organizations would evaluate their work. So it's true that attorneys might have lots of expertise and thought around issue identification. Here are fundamental issues where harm, where rights violations are occurring, but what does it look like to engage in real community feedback? And does that feedback actually shift anything you do? Or do you arrive to community like us attorneys are here, we have a case, we're building the case, we want you to be our plaintiffs. Or we have a bill, we have an idea to change the education code, and we want you to come testify in Sacramento. And, there's a lot of struggle we've been in several years with partners where they're like, well, anything we're doing is good, right? It's support, it's all reform, without really taking the time to evaluate impact together. And with CADRE, I feel like something that I've learned so much is 5 years after this case, 10 years after this bill, can you go to South LA, San Bernardino, Oakland, Richmond, the Central Valley, and are conditions different for families and students? And if you don't ask yourself about conditions, then we're trying to help partners see that that's a big gap in the approach to work. And so we've asked questions around, is your work repeating structural harms or repairing? And how do you think about this in a long-term vision about, we understand incremental work is going to happen, but how is it framed from a solidarity lens that's true collaboration? I think the other thing that's been so important that Maisie and Carl and other organizers have done is, a lot of policy groups might have an on the ground partner, and then they're like, okay, this has legitimized my approach, and it doesn't actually examine, the kind of the desire incentive we all have for power access, for access in the Capitol, for access to courts, but rather these kind of reflective tools are, if no organizers in the room, could you still ask questions of true integrity on your approach to the work? So that's a grand project that we're in, but I feel so continually grateful and humbled to get to be on the path with Maisie and others, and the parents we support and work to lift up. And then one of the last things I'll share, Maisie talked about, moving beyond transactional power at schools. Like, we have a PTA, a school site council signs off on the budget. And I'm sure if those of you are studying ed policy, you might see that incremental civil rights reform looks like a seat at the table without examining the fundamental conditions and setup of power that dehumanizes the families that we work to support. So I think, one of the things, and in our intersection of school to prison pipeline work, we also support folks working to transform the juvenile court system. And I think you can see across education and the court system that there's a real incentive to talk about young people that the system wants to save versus confronting, disinvestment in communities and families and the leadership of these communities in all of these structures. So that's what I'll share. Some of what I've learned with Maisie and others, and continue to learn. And I know, Maisie, if you want to share any last words before we open it for questions.
No. Yeah, our last slide is just Q&A. So we're good. And I think the time is perfect that we going to open it up. It's a small group, so we could have a nice conversation.
Great. And we had asked Clara to record, but in order to just, foster open and honest dialogue for you all, we can pause that now, and you can stop sharing screen, Clara, so we can just chat a bit with you three. So thanks